All right, so we've heard about the legal challenges and the origins of the civil rights movement. Let's talk about the earliest actions of the civil rights movement. Perhaps the most notable action in the civil rights movement in this decade is the Montgomery Boycott. The bus boycott was kicked off on December 1st of 1955 when Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat on a city bus to a white rider who demanded it. Now, a common misconception about Rosa Parks is that she was just tired and just decided to test and see what would happen. Like she didn't want to give up her seat because she just wanted to sit down. And that may be partially true, but it's also important to note that Rosa Parks was an activist in her own right. She was a veteran of Black politics. In Montgomery, she had protested the conviction of the Scottsboro Boys back in the 1930s. She served as a secretary to the local NAACP chapter, tried to register to vote in 1943, took the literacy test 3 times before finally getting registered. So she had a history of activism in this movement. And this was actually something that she had been planning to do for a while. So the date may have had more to do with her being tired or something like that. But let's not take away her agency. Rosa Parks is definitely an activist, and this was a planned movement. She was, of course, arrested on the bus following that, and this action resulted in a year-long boycott among the Black community in Montgomery of the segregated buses. The boycott lasted 381 days, and the Black community in Montgomery arranged alternate transportation. They walked to work or took advantage of an informal network of taxis and carpools to be able to travel to and from their jobs to where everybody would be able to stay working and still successfully boycott. Eventually, the boycott saw some success. The Supreme Court ruled against segregation on public transportation. Now, this was extremely significant because this basically launched the nonviolent crusade for racial justice that would be characterized by the figure of Martin Luther King Jr. and particularly prominent in the 1960s. This boycott also achieved attention and support from around the nation, utilizing television reporting and things like that, not only around the nation, but also around the world. And we also see the emergence of a young Martin Luther King Jr. who came to Montgomery to support that movement as well. The language of freedom is also pervasive in this movement as it's growing, and it has a range of meanings, like children being able to go to public libraries, standing up for your rights, freedom of the mind, adults enjoying political rights and economic opportunities, eradicating segregation and disenfranchisement, the right to service at lunch counters and shops, to be addressed as Mr. or Mrs. instead of boy or auntie. And the leadership of Martin Luther King is central to this movement and the fact that it gains so much steam. King was able to fuse the various meanings of freedom that are coming from various sectors, different people wanting different things out of the movement, and bring them into a kind of coherent whole, merging the various causes and experience of the Black community with those of the nation more generally, gaining sympathy around the nation and around the world as well. King also had a distinct capacity to reach not only Black Americans, but white Americans as well. He appealed to white America by stressing the protesters' love of country and devotion to national values. His philosophies of nonviolence, civil disobedience, Christian love, and forgiveness, the idea of meeting evil with good, hate with love, and violence with peaceful demands for change. Now, the connections between struggles of African Americans and other non-whites overseas were also made. The idea was that if Africa was gaining its freedom, independence from their colonial overlords, then why must Black America lag behind? We see out of this as well the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King, as a coalition of chiefly black ministers and other civil rights activists that pressed for desegregation. Now, this, of course, is not going to happen without considerable resistance. We see a certain amount of intransigence from white Southerners, with their responding movement massive resistance. A contributing factor to this was the general lack of federal backing. Montgomery only desegregated after a court order and would not have achieved success without that intervention. The Supreme Court's ruling, though, in the Brown decision, for example, required all deliberate speed in implementing the ruling, left a lot of room for interpretation. Eisenhower was also kind of generally ambivalent. He was reluctant to act in this area. Personally, he wasn't a fan of segregation, but he was unwilling to endorse the ruling and left an opening for massive resistance to take hold in southern cities. We see in 1956, 106 congressmen, all from southern states, signing on to the Southern Manifesto, officially denouncing the Brown decision as a clear abuse of judicial power and calling for resistance to forced integration. We also see anti-desegregation laws passed in many states that would block desegregation, with Virginia pioneering the strategy of closing schools that were ordered to desegregate, or offering funds to send white students to private schools instead. Some states acted to ban organizations like the NAACP, and we also see the revival of the Confederate flag, used explicitly to counter the growing civil rights movement. Now, at one point, Eisenhower is forced to act when it comes to civil rights, and that happens in Arkansas, in Little Rock. The Central High School in Little Rock was one of the schools ordered to desegregate, and at the start of the new school year, 9 black students were attempting to attend Central High School in Little Rock. The governor, Orville Faubus, used the National Guard to block students entering the school, obstructing a court-ordered integration. This use of the National Guard ultimately forced Eisenhower's hand a little bit, and in response, he deployed federal troops, calling the National Guard to federal service to ensure the safety of those black students as they attended that school. Eisenhower saw the order of the governor as a direct flouting of the law, and so to preserve the authority of the federal government, he called the National Guard to federal service and sent the 101st Airborne Division to escort the students into the school. They stayed all year long. The school was then shut down the following year. It's also here that we can see some of the more well-known pictures of the tensions around the efforts to integrate Southern society and the very strong feelings on both sides of that. Now, as I say, this is really the very beginnings of the civil rights movement, and most of the major action is actually happening in the next decade of the 1960s, something we won't unfortunately get to talk about very much. So in our next lecture, we'll try and wrap this up, segue into the next decade.